Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we learned how to create our own JWT token, deal it out to the client. So when we access the page, we got our access token, and then we've set up the service and configured it. So based on how we receive this access token, we are then going to validate it in a certain way. Then that allows us to access certain authorized endpoints. In this episode, we're going to create a client which will be able to store this token that we deal out, which can later be used for authorization with an API. So for this, what I will do is I will go ahead and create a new project. So I will add new project. Let's create an application. I'll call it client, since this is going to be a client that's going to be requesting a JWT token and storing it. And again, I'm just going to start with blank. For this, I will actually, let's go into startup. Let's delete all the comments. Let's go into startup here, and I'll just copy this middleware here, so I don't have to set it up again. Don't know what that breakpoint is. Okay, and for our services, I'll just add controllers. Again, I'll just copy this. And now let's just type in services, add authentication. Okay. And now I'll just set up some middle ground so we have something to work with, and you sort of know where we're going. So again, we are going to start with a simple example of a controllers folder and a home controller .cs and controllers. What is this? What is this? Breakpoint keeps appearing. Okay. Public action result index. Let's create an index page. Probably could have copied it. Let's just return view here. Copy this. Let's call this secret. And authorize. Okay. And now let's just bring in the pages. So views, I'll just copy this folder, I'll paste it in here, and double check I don't have anything gimmicky in the views. And I don't. Okay. Let's close that. So our end goal here is to be able to access this authorized endpoint and still retain the access token that we're going to receive from our server. Remember that the access token that we're going to be storing in our client is not going to be used for authorization on our client. We're still going to be using the cookie authentication to authorize here. We will use the access token to access a secured API, which is then going to check the access token with the authentication server. In this case, we just want to be able to have the access token in this scope and still be able to access this authorized endpoint. So let's close this, and we will go into our services and we will set up the authentication. So first of all, what I want to do is I want to make use of the add auth services, and I will call this our server. I'll put some config here, which I'm not going to fill out just yet. What I will do is I will also add the cookie middleware so we can authenticate here, and I will just call this client cookies, or rather client cookie. And for our add authentication, what I want to do is I want to grab the config, and in here I want to state three things. What are we going to use for authentication? What are we going to do when we sign in? And how are we going to check if we're allowed to do something? So the first option is the config, and sorry, not the config, the default authenticate schema is what we want to set, and we want to set it to client cookie. All we're doing with this configuration is we check the cookie to confirm that we are authenticated, right? So this is the first point. We're essentially setting the default authenticate schema, right? This is what it is. The second config that we want to set is the sign-in scheme, and this will be the client cookie as well. And with this config, we're basically saying when we sign in, we will deal out a cookie. All right. And the final, but I'd say the most important one in our case is the default challenge schema. And what we're doing here is we are, let me point this to our server first. We'll use this to check if we are allowed to do something. So if we are hitting an authorized endpoint, instead of redirecting us to the login screen, how it usually happened with the cookie services, what this is going to do now is it's going to use our auth flow to then find out if we are allowed to do something. So essentially, we will need to go through our server to be able to receive a client cookie. What I want to do is I actually want to just take my client and I want to start the application here. So let's go ahead and just run this. Okay, and we're just gonna go through some of these errors that it's gonna give us, and we're gonna fill these out one by one, and I'm gonna explain what they are. Okay, so the callback path. Also, I will be referring to the auth spec right here, which is essentially the standard, basically the specification. This is the paper that basically states how auth should be working. And the path that we're going to be implementing is authorization code grant. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing. In this scenario, we are the resource owner, and the client is the thing that we are currently building. Okay, the authorization server is what we have, and the user agent is going to be the page on the browser, right? So this is the browser, and this right here is what's called a back channel, right? So this never hits the browser. So this is where the browser is, and it will get redirected to the authorization server. It will do its communication there, and again, it will go to the client as well. Now, we are dealing with an error for a callback path, and the callback path is essentially this redirect URI, which is going to be generated by our auth service, and that's how the authorization server will know to send the authorization code back to the user agent, which will be our browser, and the access token back to the client, which will be in our back channel. So what I will do is I will grab this URL here. I'll go back to my Visual Studio, and what I will do is I'll go into my config, and I'll grab the callback path. Okay, and actually I didn't need to grab my URL because what this is it specifies an endpoint in the middleware itself. So all we have to do is basically say provide it a path for this endpoint, and all the rest of the functionality will be taken care of. So let's just call it auth callback. Okay, so let's go ahead and put a semicolon here since that's the end of that. And now if we go back to our browser, if we refresh, that should recompile and we should get a different error, right? So this client ID goes hand in hand with the client secret, which basically identifies this particular client and registers it as something we trust, okay? And usually when you set up auth with Google and you create an account, that's when they deal out this client ID and this client secret. So this is individual to each user and each client, because let's say I want to build an application that is going to consume Google authentication. I'm going to go create a Google account, and they're going to give me unique ID and secret, and then I can go ahead and put them into my application. So that would make my client unique, okay? In this case, I don't have anything that deals these out, so I'm just going to go ahead and put some mock values here, okay? So let's go ahead and just say client ID and client secret. We're going to say secret here. Okay, and you will see how this is sent to the server in a minute. Okay, so now that's there. Let's go ahead and refresh again and see what it tells us. Okay, so authorization endpoint. This is a good one. This is something that is going to be redirecting us to our server, and that's when we're going to be essentially authorizing, because once we have authorized, we keep the state of authentication as a cookie, but the authorization state is given to us by our server and is stored within the cookie, and we'll look at that as well. But what I want to do here is essentially, let's go into the Solution Explorer. I will grab the URL from the server, or actually, I probably could grab it from the constants. Let's take this here. And am I in the wrong startup? I am. And let's close all that. And just have this startup open. Okay. Config authorization endpoint. I'm gonna paste this here without the extra brackets. Okay. So let's go ahead and give this auth slash, let's say, login. All right, or we can call it authorize. But login might be a little bit more familiar, but we'll call it authorize. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this endpoint. We're going to create a new controller that we're going to name auth controller.cs, and let's inherit from controller. Okay, let's create an endpoint. Action result authorize. Okay, return view, and since we're going to have to log into in order to authorize, I'm already preemptively, because I know that this is going to happen, I will just go ahead and make these HTTP post and the get, and I'm not going to create even a proper login form. I'm just going to pass a username here so I can just distinct this function from this one. Okay, so we got the authorization endpoint. Let's go ahead and refresh this again. Okay, token endpoint. So the token endpoint. So this is the part where we're going to try and request the token. So authorization endpoint is so the user agent, the browser, once it goes to the client, it will basically go ahead and redirect the user agent to the authorization server, right? So this will be the authorization endpoint. We will authenticate, right? So we're gonna put in our credentials, and then this is the callback path. So now we're gonna be back in our browser, but not entirely. At this point, when we're back, we're still gonna see sort of a blank screen where this will go to the token endpoint, and what it will do is it will provide the authorization code that we received here, and the authorization server will go ahead and deal out an access token then, which we can use. So let's go ahead and fill this token endpoint out. I'm gonna go ahead and just copy this line, and I'm gonna say token endpoint, and I'm gonna just put this to token. And again, let's go ahead and create a public action result token and return view for now. There is going to be no view for this. Okay, and I think that was the last of it. Let's go ahead and refresh. Okay, so we're at the home page. Let's go ahead and make this distinct a little bit because we're going to be running the server and the client side by side in order for this to work. So let's go ahead and say that this is the client homepage and client secret page. And for my server as well in the index, let's go ahead and say, server homepage, and let's say server secret page. Okay, let's make sure that the pages have changed. Okay, so client homepage. Now let's close this and let me show you how to set up your project to run side by side. What we want to do is right click on your solution. We will go into properties, and we will grab the startup project, and what we'll do is we'll select multiple startup projects. We will grab the client, we'll say start, and we'll grab the server where we'll say start as well, apply, okay, and save, right? So now when you will click start, what will happen is you will essentially have both of your projects start. So let's go ahead and run this and see how this pans out. All right. So there I have my two tabs. One's a client homepage and one's a server homepage. Nice. So on my client, let's go ahead and say home/secret. Right. So this is going to redirect me to my authorization endpoint. Right. So I'm going to press enter. And here you can see this exception. But if I delete the rest of the URL, and I'll cut it, and I'll press enter, I'm actually on the server homepage. So let's go back. And another thing I want to point out here is in the URL, we have a bunch of stuff here as our parameters, which we're going to have to fill out. But if you want to know what these parameters are, you will see it's client ID, it's an empty scope, resource type code, redirect URI, blah, blah, blah. So this is where we're going to go back to. And if you look at the redirect URI, you will see that it's auth callback, right? So at the moment, we are at the stage where we're being redirected to the authorization server, which has the redirect URI back to our callback path, okay? Simple enough. Now all we have to do is implement this authentication bit and actually accept these parameters. If you want to know a little bit more about these parameters, we can look at the spec. So this stuff describes the step, and then we come to the section which says authorization request, and here we will see which parameters are required and which are optional. Redirect URI being an optional one, but still this is the auth middleware passes all these parameters. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and implement all of these parameters. So let's go ahead and open up Visual Studio. I'll put it to the side here so we can see it. Whoa. Right here so we can see it. And let's go ahead and fill this out. So these are all going to be strings. So a response type, and we can actually just copy this as well. So there's 5 of them. Client ID, redirect URI, scope, and state. Okay, so at this point, once we get redirected to our login page, we're capturing all of the parameters that are being passed to our login page or authorization or authentication page. At this point, it's all pretty mixed up. But let's go ahead and bring in this page. So I'm gonna create a auth folder with an authorized page, so CS_HTML. And in here, I will need a model where I will pass in a string, which is essentially where I want it to redirect me. Okay, so this will be a forged redirect route. And in here, let me just put this so I don't lose my IntelliSense. Form /auth /authorize. This is going to be the most ghetto form you've seen. Let's create an input of type text, and name will be username. So this is the username that I will be passing, and an input of type submit, and the name. I don't think I need a name, and value will be submit, right? So we're just gonna submit a username, and that's it, no more. And so we basically don't lose this data in transit. What I want to do is I want to build this into a query and pass all these parameters to here as well. All right, so what I will do is I'll copy all of these. Let's put a comma here next to the username, and all of this stuff, I'm gonna bring it with me to the next step, okay? Because this is what we will need to use if we look at the authorization response. We will need to have the code, the state, and actually that's pretty much it. We don't need the whole thing. We will need the redirect URI, but just for safety, client ID, we'll keep it. Response type, we'll keep it, just so you know how to use it. Or actually, no, never mind. Let's go ahead and remove the stuff we don't need. And what was it? State or scope? Can't remember. Code and state. Okay, let's go ahead and remove scope. Actually, it's probably worth to describe what these parameters mean, you will be able to find out by visiting the authentication, but quickly, just to sort of give you a quick explanation, response type, this is basically the authorization flow type. So something like an enum, we're basically specifying what kind of authorization flow we are requesting. And this is pretty much a client ID, right? So an identifier for the client. So the Google will have a configuration for my client, and it will allow me to have a certain type of their authorization flows enabled with a specific redirect URI, right? So this is really redirect URI. We don't need a comment for this, but when we go to the, if you stick around till the identity server part, you're gonna see how this redirect URI can only be specified in the configuration. So if you ever done something like Facebook auth, they will allow you to redirect only to specific redirect URIs that are set up for your client. So even if somebody knows your client ID, they cannot redirect you to a different URI that hasn't been set up for this client. Scope basically means what claims am I, what information I'm requesting, right? What information I want. So if if in my scope I can pass something like email, grandma, and tell. What this will essentially say is that in my access token I want an email, I want my grandma cookie, and I want my telephone. Okay, telephone number. And what the state means, basically random string generated to confirm that we are going back to the same client, right? So the client generates this state string, and if the state changes once we go back to our client, this is essentially going to error that basically we haven't like requested this authorization. Essentially, this is the state is like non-existent, right? So the state has to persist once we go back in order to confirm that it's coming back from the correct authorization endpoint. Okay, so at this point, authorize endpoint, we're going to be logged in. So what we want to do is redirect back to our callback point. So what I'm going to use here is a redirect, and let's build a redirect URI. And I will be using a query builder. Right, let's create a code. So I'll mock out this code to something static so we can reuse it, and usually you would generate it, but const string code. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so this can be anything. I'm just mocking this out, and I'm feeling like this explanation will get a little bit confusing, so for now I will stop here, and I will actually construct a query here, pass it to the view, so we can see how when we're submitting this form, it's going to redirect us back to this authorization point here, which we have defined in our middleware right here. So let's go ahead and do that here. I'm going to go ahead and create a query, which is going to be a query builder, which is a nice way to construct your queries for HTML, which are going to be in this sort of format. So foo bar. Okay. Okay, so query, what I want to do is I want to add, what are we passing? We're going to be passing the redirect URI and state. So let's go ahead and grab the redirect URI. We can rename it like so. So we're going to add this parameter, redirect URI, with this value. And we're going to do the same for the state here. So let's go ahead and pass this here. And now that this is done, we are going to assign the model to query.toString. We call toString, and it's going to get evaluated into this sort of format. This is what it's going to be passing into my model here, and all I want to do is essentially just go ahead and set my model here if it will allow me. Come on. That. And yep. And now maybe URL. Nope. Okay. So what I will do is I will grab this URL. Let's go ahead and pop it here, and in here we'll put the model, right? So it didn't let me put the at here, so I'm just constructing the URL here, and we'll be able to see it in the action here. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch our application. And I have an error here. Let's see what's up. Okay, so in here we'll just pass an empty string just to satisfy this. What I will do is I will put a breakpoint in these two places, and let's actually debug. Alright, so for my client, let's go ahead and say home/secret. Okay, so this has redirected me to the auth controller, alright, from my client. And in here, I will have my client ID, my redirect URI, which is pointing me to the callback URI, alright. The scope is null because we're not requesting any scope at this point. The state is just a random string, okay. Response type is code, so if we go to this auth page, this is the authorization code grant, and this is essentially the shorthand for the, where is it, the response type, which must be set to code, which is essentially the enum type or the enum value for this flow. So if we go back to Visual Studio, let's go ahead and press F5 so we get served our page. And whoa, it's actually worth doing something like this, so displaying the model that we have here. So if I refresh, I will be able to actually see the query string. And of course, I don't have Razor Pages dynamic compilation enabled, so we're gonna have to start over. Alright, home secret, and there we go. And there we can see the redirect URI, right? So this is encoded, URI encoded, so you know how we can pass slashes because it's part of the URI syntax. And the other part is that we have state. Okay, so let's go ahead and submit some username like Bob. Submit, and I have royally messed up somewhere. Authorize. Okay, so at URL here, and this will have to get recompiled. Let me see if I can actually, I'll stop this. And let's enable dynamic compilation. So startup. Okay, let's add a Razor compile. It's not here. Let's go into our solutions and let's manage NuGet packages, since we can add it for both our client and our server from here. So let's go ahead and grab Microsoft aspnetcore. So asp.aspnetcore. I already have it pointed out down here, but for those of you who can't see, .mvc.razor.runtime compilation. And this is the package that we want. I will leave the name of the package in the description in case you don't want to type this out. Let's go ahead and add it to our client and server. And let's go ahead and just press install. Alright, let's go back into our startup. Let's add Razor runtime compilation. And I think this should do it, or hopefully. Let's copy this. Oh, not cut it, copy. And let's put it into our client as well. Okay, let's close everything since I have briefly forgot where I was. Sorting that out, and let's see. So we're trying to get from our client into home/secret. We go to the auth controller. We are then returned to the view. We want to authenticate as Bob. We submit our form to the authorized page. So we have Bob, we have the redirect URI, and we have our state. All right. Now, what the auth spec says is we essentially need to construct an authorization response, which is going to go back to our redirect URI, and that will have to contain the code and the state. So again, at this point, it's just your regular old HTML. Let's go ahead and use the query builder, the same as we did before, to basically construct. So we can just basically copy this. We'll grab the code and the state, and we'll just put the code here, and we will redirect back to the redirect URI, and we can go ahead and add the query.toString on the end. Okay, and at this point, this should go ahead and redirect us back to our auth and what's called callback endpoint. And if you have forgotten what that is, in our startup, where we have set the callback path here. Now this has all the functionality to handle the code and the state that we pass to it. Okay, so at that point, that becomes a black box. And what I mean by black box is you don't know what's happening there. Okay, I don't know what's happening there. It's just going to go to that endpoint, and what that endpoint is going to do, and the reason I know this is because I read this document. If we go down to access token request, this is what it's going to do, right? Because this is the step that it's doing after we receive the authorization code at our callback path. What it's going to do is it's going to take the authorization code and it's going to put it to the token endpoint and send it to the authorization server, right? It's going to send it this authorization code, and we're going to get a redirect URI back as well. Okay, and we're going to take a look at what that looks like as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at the request and what we need. All right, so not this, error response, we don't want that. We want access token request. Okay, so this is when we're sending our code, and we're going to be receiving it back in the redirect URI when it's going to get redirected back. Okay, so hopefully I'm not rambling on too much. I don't think you can mention too much information with this, because this is such a niche topic. It was a little bit hard to grasp for me, so I don't want to state too little information. Okay, so what parameters do we need? I'm taking a look at these here, and I'm just going to be passing them to here. Okay, so string grant type. I'm going to copy this a few times, delete this. We're going to need the code, redirect underscore URI. Make sure I don't spell this wrong, and client ID. Okay, so at this point we're going to have the code, which is going to be equal to this, and here what we're going to be doing is pretty much some mechanism for validating the code. So the code will usually be stored in the database and then retrieved, and you will check its expiry date, etc., because the server contains all the information about the codes that it deals out, and the codes have approximately like 5-minute expiry time. So if we don't grab our token within 5 minutes, the code expires, and we will basically result with an error when we try if the code is invalid. Grant type, this is just describing the way, the basically flow of access token request, right? So the way that it requests the access token. So the code at this point is basically confirmation of the authentication process, right? Because once you go through the authorization authentication login process, you get dealt out a code, and this is a confirmation that you have gone through that process. That's when you go here, and remember that this happens in the back channel. Okay, redirect URI, self-explanatory. Client ID, I already explained this. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this needs to return. Access token response, again, I will leave a link for this document. You can go ahead and read this. This is a very boring thing to read, but once you get into it, and you will understand the whole thing. All right, so access token response, it was breaking out here, but this is essentially what we want to return. We want to return a JSON response, charset UTF-8, and we want this object here. Now, we are not going to go into the refresh token part and the expires in value. all we will do is we'll go into these two, access token and token type. Okay, so the access token, we already know how to create it. We have done this. If I put this back here, we have already done this in our home controller here. So I will just go ahead and copy this, and I'll pop it here. So after our mechanism for validating the code and the client ID and that the redirect URI is valid, let's go ahead and import all of this. And I'm because this is such a this implementation bit is not part of auth. This is just you validating that this information is correct. Let's bring in all of this stuff that we have done here. All right. So at this point we have a token. Let's go ahead and call this an access token. Let's create a var response object. This is going to be just a plain object. So if we hover over this, the type is going to be local variable. There's basically no type to it. It's just going to be an object. And what I want to do here is I want to create a access token property, and this is going to assign the value of access token to the access token property. And the next thing I want is token type, which in our case is going to be bearer. Okay, so token type equals bearer, and we'll stop here. We'll go into this example parameter where it's basically, or actually, you know what? It won't hurt. So let's go ahead and say raw claim or underscore claim. Let's say auth tutorial. So what we do with this now is this is essentially an object, and it's telling us that we need to reply with a JSON. So let's go ahead and serialize this into a JSON, because this is not our regular response to the browser. We're responding back to a sort of a service, you know, not a browser, and the service needs a little bit of help in basically constructing the response. So let's say response JSON equals JSON convert. We're going to serialize this object. So response object. Okay, so now that we have this object, we need to go ahead and write it to the response. So we can grab the response, we can grab the body, and we can write async. Let's await on this async call, and for this we will need to make this async task. Oh, okay. So this will accept a byte array, so I will need to convert this to a byte array. So response bytes equals, and since at this point this is a string, we already know how to encode the string, which we did here. So let's go ahead and just copy this method here. But instead of a secret, we'll convert our response. Okay. And now let's supply our response bytes. So we'll start at the beginning of the array, right? And then we need to supply the count. So let's go ahead and just say response bytes. Oh, response bytes dot length. All right. And the reason this is done this way is for more complicated procedures, which we're not going to go into now. So at this point, the response will have the JSON object written to it. And all we want to do now is basically redirect. Okay, so let's go ahead and redirect, and let's put our redirect URI here. Okay, and I'll put a breakpoint here, so again we can see what is happening. So remember that this token endpoint is, if we go back to the authorization flow, right there, we're going to receive the code, and this is going to be happening on the server. We're going to get back our access token, and this is what we're essentially trying to do. We're going to grab the code and the redirect URI, and once we have done our bits of validating the code and constructing the access token, this is when we're going to return it. refresh token, don't worry about it, we'll get to it. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch this and see what happens. Okay, so on our client, we're going to go to the home secret page. We are redirected to the authorize page where we see the redirect URI. Let's go ahead and say, again, Bob. And here we're going to be redirected back to our client, but we're not really going to see this, okay? And the next breakpoint that gets triggered is this token endpoint, right? And if we look in the browser, we are still on this login page. So this endpoint is hit in the back channel. So your browser is never aware of this transaction happening. Let's see what we get. So the code is the same thing that we have created here. Grant type is authorization code. This is getting populated by the middleware as per the flow that we're using. Redirect URI, as you can see, this is the same callback URI, and because the response is different, that's how it's gonna figure out what to do with it. And then the client ID. Client ID is the same. We use it to confirm if this flow is allowed to happen. So let's take a look at our response object here. Again, just access token that we have created. Remember that the payload and the header we can decode. The signature is the authorization part. And here's some other stuff that we have put in there. And the redirect URI, this is where we're basically going back to. Okay, so let's press F5 and see what happens. Okay, and this exception has happened because I have been waiting for too long, so let's go ahead and just refresh this. We'll see the same thing again, and now, actually I'll keep the breakpoint here, but I'll just continue. And we should get redirected back to the secret page. And if we take a look at the application, we can now see the cookie. So if I go back to Visual Studio, home controller, not this home controller, the client home controller, and let's put a breakpoint here. Let's take a look at what we can find here. Okay, so I'm gonna refresh window, and what I will do is I will go into the locals. So locals window, so I can expect what objects I have here. And primarily what I want to take a look at is the user and the claims, right? Because this is why we're doing this. And they're empty. Why are they empty, right? So at this point we have successfully passed the challenge. So if where we authenticate with our server, but we don't have our claims, that's because they're in the access token, right? And the fusion of your identity and cookie and the access token doesn't happen automatically, okay? There's a few things that you can do, and I'll show you what to do now. Okay, this is what this tutorial is about. Let's go ahead and try to extract the token from our HTTP context. All right. Token async is what we want to call. And what this function does, it comes from the, what namespace does it come from? Take a look. It comes from the authentication namespace, and all it wants is a string of token name. And we have, well, we haven't actually named our token access token, but this is its name, right? Not triple S, but double S. And if I launch this again, I should be still signed in. I can always check the cookie, but this is how you would extract the token, and I don't think it's going to be there just yet because of one setting that we haven't set. So you can see the cookie is still there, and if we go to home secret, we should. Oh, this is a task. Okay, my bad. So let's make this asynchronous task. Okay, let's await on this. Okay, and this is actually going to be a token. Never mind. Let's run this again. Let's not refresh here, but rather home secret. Okay, if we take a look at the token, it is null. And we can actually try to take a look at this again. I'll refresh this and we'll re-authenticate. So again, Bob, access token, right token, yep. And if we take a look at the token again, it's null. Okay, so it doesn't work. This is the reason for this is if we go into startup in this configuration, we have to explicitly say for it to save the token. So config save token, and we're going to set it to true. Now you might be thinking at this point, what's the point of requesting the token? And where is the token anyway? How can we authorize without the token? Right? Why do we request the token? We got the token so we could receive this cookie, right? And that's how we got authenticated. And how you use that access token after you received it is up to you. But this is how we got our client cookie. So what I've taught in the previous tutorials regarding using your policies to get the claims, etc., we're going to get to this in a second. But let's go ahead and set save tokens to true. I'm going to run this again. Let's go to home secret. Let's refresh this. Token should be null because when we have requested it, we didn't have the option to save the token. So let's go ahead, reset the session. We'll get redirected. Say Bob. And access token. Okay. And now the token will be set to our value here. Okay. So now that we have the access token, we can use it to call multiple APIs that can be protected by our server as well. So essentially, what this token will be used for is not for necessarily accessing authorized endpoints here, but we still can, and I'll show you how. But primarily, the idea for using this access token is to essentially include it in the request to an API, the same way what we did with Postman in the header or in the URL. We're going to send that request to an API, and then the API is going to go to the server and make sure that the token is valid, right? So it's going to be like a triangle of communication there. From this point on, let's say you're like, all right, I have this access token, but this endpoint isn't actually validated based on the access token. What the hell, right? I want it to be working with the access token that I have. Well, what we can do is go into the startup, and in our configuration, right, we will grab one of the events, and this might look similar to what we did in our server. And I mean, it is quite similar, but yeah. Let's go ahead and create new auth events. Let's remove all of this and we'll import the namespace. Okay, and in here, we'll grab the onCreating ticket event, and we will grab the context with which we're working here. And again, since this is a function that's going to return a task at the end, all I want to do is just return task.completeTask. And similar to what we did in our security project, what this onCreating function allows us to do, this context function, this gives us access to the access token, and the stuff that we can do with it is just pretty much what I've showed you how to do in, in this home controller here. So we're actually going to just go ahead and grab this decode function. Let's go into the startup here. And I'll grab this decoding here and actually put it here. Part, let's go ahead and grab the part. So I will grab the access token. Let's grab the access token from the context. So we have our access token. Let's grab the payload. So access token split a dot, and I am gonna grab the second part, which is going to be the payload. I can paste it into here, and I'm just gonna end up with a bunch of bytes, at which point if I decode it, I will have a JSON payload. Alright, so this is a base 64 payload, and this is a JSON payload at this point. So what I want to do is essentially I just want to create a bunch of claims, right, which is really a dictionary collection, a key value pair, which is essentially the JSON of the, well, Luckily, it's the JSON notation as well. JSON convert ter converter. Yeah. Oh no. JSON convert. And I need to install. Yeah, I guess let's install instancesoft.json. And let's deserialize object. And I want to deserialize it to a dictionary of string. Okay, and the object that I want to deserialize is the JSON payload. Okay, so for each, this is actually going to be a list of claims. Claim in claims. I want to go ahead and grab the context. I want to grab the identity, and I want to add a claim. Okay, and all I will be doing is adding new claims. Why doesn't it just import the namespace? That would be nice. All right, and in here, let's just go ahead and say claim key and claim dot value. I will put a breakpoint somewhere here so we can take a look at the context as well and what that represents. But this is essentially how I'm going to use the claims in my access token and populate them in my client. So if you do want to use your access token for in your client, you still can. And this is how you would go around accomplishing it. You can now, once you have populated these claims, you can go into Home Controller and use all the previous methods of policy authorization that I have mentioned. Alright, so home secret, I will have to clean the cookie. Let's refresh. Bob. Grab the access token. Okay. And here we are. So here we're still loading. So pay in mind that this event happens after we have received the access token. Okay, so the access token, here we have it. Claims, we have 6 claims. We have the sub ID, we have the granny cookie, and we have all the other stuff that we have essentially put into our payload of the token, right? Okay, so if we continue here, what we'll essentially see if we refresh the home secret, if I removed it, the breakpoint, I did. So what we'll see here is we still have the token, but now if I go to, why is my local window always disappearing? Okay, user identity, and if we take a look at claims, we can rather take a look at this list of claims, right? We have all these different claims, and the way we would access them is the same way that I have explained in the basic tutorials, somewhere around, let's go into startup. It would be one of the requirements, wouldn't it? And let's, if we go take a look, right, so this way, and remember that you have a access to this list of well-known claims, so you can use this type to essentially provide to as this comparison. So x.type equals JWT registered claims, and you will be able to extract the value of that claim. So you can grab the user ID. Okay, so wrapping up this video, hopefully you understand that what is happening here is we are requesting a access token to our client. Okay, so the thing that we're actually using the access token for isn't present yet, but what we can do is utilize the stuff that we have in our access token for our client as well. All right, so we can kind of share the authorization information that we request from the server with the client as well, which is not entirely correct, but hey, you're allowed to do what you want. And I have done this sort of thing myself a few times. So in the next episode, we'll introduce an API to the mix and see how we can pass the access token to that and validate it with our authorization server. So just again to quickly recap, we go to our authorization server, we authenticate, we get back to the authorization code, we then send back the authorization code to the authorization server with the redirect URI, we get back the access token, and then on the client, once we have the access token, this is when we choose to load it into our cookies. And once we're back, we also generate a cookie, which is an authentication cookie for us and an authorization for this application, all right? But we also store the access token using this save tokens option, so we can then use this access token to make requests to an API. But we also load the claims into our cookie so our client can benefit from the token. Okay, this will be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, I know it's a hard topic, so make sure you leave a comment. If you would like me to go a little bit more in depth into a specific area of the auth flow or JWT tokens, do leave a comment as well. I will make an additional video on that. Don't forget to share, subscribe, and as always, see you in my other episodes.